Are you muted?
You're good.
Do I have to hit got it?
What's that?
Okay. Welcome, welcome, welcome. And thank you to each one of you who is here today. I am really, really grateful. Somebody asked me why I say that every time. And the reason is because I mean it. If you were not here, I wouldn't be here either. You can't be a conductor without an orchestra. You can't be a general without an army. You can't be a teacher without students. And so I'm grateful to each and every one of you who comes to study here with us. Nobody here for the first time? Okay. Let's begin with the bracha. Baruch atah Adonai, Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kiddushanu b'mitzvotav, v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. Blessed are you, O Lord our God, ruler of the universe, who has made us a holy people by means of his commandments and has commanded us to study Torah. Amen. Before we start new material, can I have just a few minutes to go back over what we did last time? I don't know how you feel about it. To me, last week's session was the high point of the whole series. And what made it special for me were the stories. That story about Elie Wiesel walking in when I was talking about him and then taking out some paper and keeping notes of what I was saying. I love that story, not because I was flattered by what happened, but because it demonstrates the truth that whoever hears a story and then retells it, it's a different story. That the original meaning of the story dies on the speaker's lips. The speaker already hears a different version. And therefore, no psalm can be frozen. That's why we studied Psalm 95 first as it was said in the time of the temple, and then as it was understood by the Kabbalists in Swat 1,500 years later. They understood it, the key word for them was menuchati, and they understood it to mean not the promised land, but the promised day, the day of rest. And they believed that it meant that God had created two temples, one in space, which got destroyed, and one in time, which cannot ever be destroyed. And that either one is as precious as the other. Shabbos for them was the kingdom in time. And you couldn't enter this kingdom unless you prepared yourself, unless you closed the door on the week that was over and closed the door on the week that lies ahead and focused on your neighborhood, your house, and your family. And 400 or 500 years later, my parents, who'd never been to Tzfat, heard that lesson that you can't just slam the brakes and go into Shabbos. They understood that you have to make Shabbos. It's a wonderful expression, to make Shabbos. And that you have to start no later than Friday afternoon at the latest. And you got to cook and clean and prepare a festive meal and walk to shul together with other people who share your values and your goals. And then when the sun sets, Erev Shabbos bows and leaves and makes room for the queen to arrive. That's why I told you the story about how my father would let the phone ring and ring and ring and ring and wouldn't answer it, because he knew that it was his biggest customer calling and that he was calling with a complaint, but he didn't want to deal with that. That was tomorrow's problem, not today's. How can you deal with problems when you're hosting a queen who has come to your house? So here we have one poem that meant one thing in the time of the temple, and then 1,500 years later meant something else, and then 400 or 500 years later meant something else. It's the same stone, but look how differently it was understood in different periods. And one more word, if I may. What was the great sin that the Israelites committed, Masa ad Meriva, according to the psalm? That there were other sins they committed. What was so special about these two? The answer is they had just gotten out of Egypt. They had just crossed the Red Sea. They had just seen their enemy drown in the sea. And 2 days later, they start complaining. That's ingratitude. And I quoted one of my very favorite expressions. If you just learn this one expression, it's worth coming to class. The Jewish expression is nicht zu versündigen, not to sin. Somebody calls you on the phone and says, hello, how are you? The answer is nicht zu versündigen, not to complain. Because I could tell you all the things that are wrong with me, but that's not what I'm supposed to do. I'm supposed to tell you all the things that are right with me. And by the way, there's one thing wrong with me. I got 31 teeth that are working fine. No, I got one tooth that doesn't work. If I focus only on that, that's being ungrateful. I can see, I can stand, I have what to eat, I have a good wife, I have, Baruch Hashem, good kids, I have very intelligent grandchildren. It's true that I can't walk so good. And it's true that my business is of Taurus. But in the total scheme of things, that's not so bad. Most of my life is okay. And so I ought to focus on the part that is good and not complain about the part that is not. So I hope you remember that expression, nicht zu versündigen. Next week, I'll tell you another expression that I learned from my wife. I want to do several things today. Number one, I want to study Psalm 100, which is part of the daily morning service. According to the tradition, you stand when you come to this prayer. And it's the entree into Psuke de Zimra, the songs of celebration. If you look at it, it looks like a very easy song. Only 5 lines. The Hebrew looks easy. I'm not so sure. After we study it together as Pshat, I want to restudy it through the eyes of 3 teachers. The first is Rabbi Dr. Art Green, and I'll explain why I use those titles. Then through the eyes of Dr. Rabbi Aaron Tversky, and I'll explain why I reversed the titles there. And the third, through the eyes of somebody whom I think most of you remember, Dave Letterman. Everybody here remember Dave Letterman? I'm going to study his commentary on Psalm 100. Let me begin with Art Green for a minute. Why do I call him Rabbi Doctor? Because he tries to do 2 things in his life. Number one, he's a professor at a distinguished university. And so what does a professor do? Professor tries to study objectively, dispassionately, the wisdom of the past. What did the past believe? That's what a scholar does. But after he does that, Rabbi Green is a rabbi. And so he asks another question. What does it mean to us here today? What does this ancient prayer, which was understood by the medievals this way, mean to us who live today? That would make him a rabbi as well as a scholar. And Aaron Tversky, Avram Tversky, is a doctor rabbi. Why do I call him that? He just died this year, I think. He was primarily a psychologist. He worked at a rehab center for recovering drug addicts in Pittsburgh. That was his main focus. How do I get these people better? His second concern was Torah. He's a great Jewish scholar, came from a great Jewish family, but his work day was curing drug addicts. And most of his clients were not Jewish. And so he focused on what medicine to give them, and only incidentally on what Torah to teach them. So I call him Dr. Rabbi. We're going to look at them each, but first let's look at Psalm 100. Zena, will you put it up? And let's all look at it carefully together. Got it? Read it to yourself, everybody. Mizmor LeTodah is the title, the Psalm of Gratitude. Second half of that verse is the beginning of the psalm. Shout out to Adonai all the earth. Serve the Lord with joy. Come before God with joyful song. Know that he, Adonai, is God. God made us, and we are God's people, the flock of God's pasture. Come to the God's gates with gratitude. Come to his courtyard, bless his name. For Adonai is good. Adonai's kindness is forever, and unto generation is God's faithfulness. That's it. 5 lines. Let me begin. What was it originally? Probably originally meant to be a psalm that you sang as you came into the courtyards of the temple in order to bring a korban todah. There were all kinds of sacrifices. There was a sin offering. You did something wrong, you brought a sacrifice to atone. There was an accidental sin offering. You did something without realizing it was wrong, and you realized afterwards you brought a sacrifice to atone for it. There was a harvest offering, and there was a thanksgiving offering. This was the one you brought when something nice happened and you wanted to express your gratitude to God. You met the right girl, you won the lottery, you went into business and everything worked out fine. Something good happened in your life, and you wanted to bring a thanksgiving offering in order to say thanks to God. I want to tell you 2 things about the thanksgiving offering. First, the law, and then a prophecy. The law is you offer it, you give some burned, some you give to the Kohen, and the rest of the animal has to be eaten on the same day, on the day that you bring the offering. Now, if you've ever seen a sheep, that's a big animal. Could you finish it by yourself in one day? Nobody could. It's too much for one person to eat in one day. So what would you do? You would invite your friends to join you, and you would have a celebration together with your friends or your family. And during the course of the meal, you would tell them what it is that you were thankful for, and they would say, congratulations. That's the origin of a practice that we have in every synagogue that I've ever been to until this day, or at least until COVID. Who knows what I'm referring to? Up until COVID, at the end of the service, the president of the shul gets up and he makes announcements. And the first announcement he makes is, until COVID, Kiddush will be served in the social hall. And Kiddush is being sponsored today by Mr. and Mrs. So-and-so in honor of their wedding anniversary, or by Mr. and Mrs. So-and-so in honor of the engagement of their son, or for some other simcha in their lives. Did they do that in your shul until COVID? Yeah, I got to tell you, I think we have underestimated the religious significance of the Kiddush. The Kiddush is what turns a group of separate individuals who don't know each other, who have nothing to do with each other, who sit facing the same way in shul, who listen, who daven. It turns, the Kiddush turns them into a community of caring people who know each other, who care about each other, who say mazel tov to each other, who give strength to each other in time of tzaras. The Kiddush turns the community, the shul, into a community. And the Kiddush is the direct descendant of the Korban Todah. Just as you had to have people around in order to bring a Korban Todah, because you had to finish it in one day, so today, after the bringing of the service, we have a Kiddush. It's like the Korban Todah, and I don't underestimate it. Let me tell you a story about what happened to me this week. Kiddush is no longer served in many synagogues because of COVID. And if it is, it's served out of doors. And there are some people like me, and I hope you're not like me, who don't always go to shul on Shabbos anymore. Lately, I've started staying home. You know why? Not only because I'm afraid of COVID, but because they now have something called Zoom and something called live stream, and I can go to any shul I want. I want to hear a great chazan besides ours. I go to Park Avenue. He's wonderful. I want to hear a great sermon. I go to Temple Emmanuel in Newton, Massachusetts. Preacher there is brilliant. I can, if I want to, I can go to California. I can go to any shul I want. Why should I go to my local shul? The big question that is going to be after COVID ends, will people come back? Because if you can go free to any other shul in the country, why should I go to my shul and pay dues? That's going to be the question. Anyway, I went this week to B'nai Jeshurun, which is a very popular shul on the west side of Manhattan. A lot of young people go there. There's a lot of spirit there. There used to be singing and dancing in the aisles. Now, not so much because of COVID. Now they require everybody in shul to wear a mask, and because it's Manhattan, and they require everybody in shul to bring proof that they've been vaccinated. Otherwise, you can't get in. So I went. Turned out they had a bat mitzvah, and the bat mitzvah was lovely. She spoke well, she sang well, and her mitzvah project was interesting. Oh, nice service. At the end of the service, there was a problem, because the custom at B'nai Jeshurun now is to serve the Kiddush out of doors. It's safer out of doors. You don't have to wear a mask. It's hard to wear a mask when you're eating. You can schmooze and socialize out of doors, in the backyard. This week was Tutkat. It poured in Manhattan. There was a gusreik, a real storm. So you can't go outside for Kiddush. And the poor parents, Nebuch, had planned the Kiddush for months and had worked with the caterer for a long time. What are you doing now? You can't go outside for Kiddush. And you can't go into the social hall because that's dangerous. What do you do? I saw the bar mitzvah parents run out in the middle of the service to go talk to the caterer, and I guessed what they must be talking about. What do you do? They came out with a solution. They had a receiving line at the end of the service, and everybody went by, said Mazel Tov. I don't think they shook hands, but they said Mazel Tov to the and Yasher Koach, to the rabbi, to the chazan, to the bar mitzvah, bat mitzvah, to the parents. And then last in line, the caterers, waitresses stood, and they handed everybody with a package, which was the contents of the Kiddush in a bag. And you could take it home. You couldn't eat it in shul, you could take it home. And it was called Kiddush to go, the new name for a new concept. That's what you have to do today. You have Kiddush to go because you can't have Kiddush in shul. But the reason I tell you that story is to show you how important Kiddush is in the modern synagogue. And it's to show you that it's a direct descendant from the Korban Todah in the time of the temple. And now let me show you how Art Green, whom I call a rabbi doctor, deals with Psalm 95, with the first two words. You want to put up the first two words again? If you can, if not, I'll talk. See the first two words, the title of the psalm, Mizmor L'Todah. Art says it can be translated two different ways. What's the obvious way? Anybody? It's right there.
Thanks.
Huh?
Thanks.
Meaning a psalm of gratitude to God, right? God has been good to me. I'm bringing a sacrifice of thanksgiving. The title of the psalm is a psalm of thanksgiving, of gratitude to God. That's one way of reading it. Steve. Yes. At this point, it always goes off for some reason. I don't know why. Okay, I'm going to continue anyway. Come in.
Hold on. Yes.
The obvious way to read it is a psalm of gratitude to God. But Art says it can be read another way. Mizmor L'Todah, a song to gratitude, a song in honor of gratitude. He says it can be read as a song to thanksgiving, because we ought to thank God for the ability to be grateful. That's one of the greatest gifts that God has given us. He calls it the best door opener to our lives. Not always, but when you have a special simcha, your heart opens with gratitude. You feel love for another human being. You feel love for the loyalty that you've received from a friend. You feel great love and great thankfulness when you recover from an illness. And if you're wise, you feel gratitude all the time for the gift of life. He says, for many people, how do we come to God? We come to God, there he goes again, I'm going to keep on going. The first step towards feeling the presence of God is out of the need to find somebody to say thanks to. Imagine having a wonderful life and not having anybody to say thanks to for it. Once the door opens, it brings you to more gratitude, more awareness of God, which brings you to more gratitude, which brings you to more awareness of God. And therefore, we ought to look upon the gift of gratitude with gratitude. It's one of the most precious gifts that we have in our lives. Pity the rich man, he says, who lives all by himself, who's lonely, and what's he going to do with his wealth if he's got nobody to share it with? He's as pitiable as the poor man who has no one to cry out to for help. They both are leading lonely lives. You got to have somebody. It's no simcha if you got nobody to share with. That's the first point he makes. So I think a significant point. You got to be grateful for the gift of gratitude. Number two, it says, Hu asanu v'lo anachnu. I don't know if you can see it on the screen. Zina? I don't know.
Give me a second. I lost it for a second. Hold on. I'm sorry. Hold on. Somehow I lost it.
Well, no. Trust me then if I read it. Okay.
There
Yeah.
it goes.
Okay.
Okay, got it.
Sentence 3, middle line. Hu asanu velo, parenthesis velo. Why parenthesis? There are two ways, the Torah was carried orally for a long time. By the time they wrote it down, they weren't sure how to spell the word lo. There are two words pronounced the same way with two different meanings. Hu asanu velo anachnu with a vav would mean he made us and therefore we are his. Hu asanu velo anachnu with an aleph would mean he made us, we didn't make ourselves. Lo anachnu, we didn't do the making. And the scribe didn't know which one was the right one. So he put one to be read and one as a footnote. And Eli Spitz put one in parentheses. There are two ways of reading the psalm. He made us, and therefore we belong to him, or he made us, we didn't make ourselves. Art Green says there's a third way to read it. If you look not at the last letter of the first word and the last letter of the next word, it makes the word aleph, which the last, you see vav and aleph, it makes, if you put it backwards, it makes aleph. And he says it means the alufo shel olam. It refers to God who is the one of the world. And the Sefer Bahir, a medieval Jewish book, says the wonder is he made us different and yet part of the whole. Every human being is different fingerprints, different personality, different character. And at the same time, we are all connected to each other and we are all part of one cosmic unity. That's what he says. So there are three ways to read it: with a vav, with an aleph, and with an aleph lamed. And that's a profound idea. And then he comes to the next line, verse 4. Come to God's gate with gratitude, enter God's courtyards with him, praise God, bless God's name. The reason God appears 4 times in the English is that Eli Spitz doesn't like to use the word he for God. God is not he, God is not she, so he keeps repeating God. Okay, maybe it simply originally must have meant, come on, join me, let's go into the temple's courtyard, singing as we come, and let's praise God as we walk into the sanctuary. I saw a social hall in La Jolla, in San Diego. And over the door of the social hall, it had these words, Ivdu et Adonai b'simcha, worship God in joy. Because that's what you do in the social hall. You eat, you sing, you dance, serve God with joy. It was one of the central teachings of Judaism, particularly the Hasidim, is that God is to be served not with fear and not with guilt and not with trepidation. God is to be served with joy. So here you have 3 different comments on the same line, verse 3. What it must have meant originally, what it meant to the Sefer Bahir, and what Art Green says it means us today. Look how one line can have 3 different meanings in 3 different generations. And then comes the last line. Why should we serve God with joy? Because God is good. And his kindness continues la'olam, which can either mean forever or to the whole world. Olam in Hebrew has both those meanings. In Yiddish, the olam is the world or the community. And God is not just good to us, God is good to the whole world in time and in space. This is a very universalistic statement. We should rejoice. We have a good God who is kind to the whole world. And ador v'dor emunato. From one generation to the next is God's faithfulness. It's an interesting word, his faithfulness, his trustworthiness. Most religions talk about how we should have faith in God. The Jewish religion says, yeah, we should have faith in God, but we should also be aware of how much faith God has in us. God, we screwed up yesterday, and God gives us a new day today. God has trust in us. God gives us freedom, knowing we're going to misuse that freedom. So we thank God for having faith in us. Maybe God has more faith in us than we deserve. Maybe God has more faith in us than we have earned or that we're entitled to. But whatever it is, God believes in us. As important as saying, I believe in God, is to say, I'm grateful God believes in me. God believes in me, then I got to live up to that. That's a great compliment, and that's a great responsibility. So we should read this verse that way. Let me now go to Dr. Rabbi Twersky and say a word about how he understands this verse. He's a psychologist, and he deals with rehab for drug addicts. He says the big problem, I don't know if this was true, the big problem for drug addicts is they're suffering from depression, and they suffer from guilt, and they suffer from a sense of failure. What's the use of trying? I tried yesterday and I couldn't get out of this trap. I tried 2 weeks ago. I said I was going to go off in the wagon. I saw the first drink that came my way and I drank it. I'm no good and I'll never change. How do you cure that? How do you overcome that? Which is just, if you don't overcome that, the drug addict will never be cured. How do you give the drug addict hope and faith in himself? He says, you say to him, Hu asanu v'lo anachnu. God made you. You didn't make yourself. And therefore, you're not to blame for how you came out. And God didn't make you perfect. You know, God didn't make anybody perfect. It says God looked over everything he made and he saw it was good. He didn't say it was perfect. He said it was good. God made you not perfect. No reason to feel failure or guilt or shame that you haven't worked out so good. God gave you one gift, the ability to get over your faults and try again. He didn't make you perfect, but he gave you a reason to not live with guilt and not live with depression and not live with a sense of failure. So that's his explanation of this song. And now I'm going to go to Dave Letterman. You remember him? I think he's still alive, but he's retired. He was one of the early stars of late night television. People stayed up to hear Dave Letterman, and they remember his 10 best lists. Remember those? And he used to have all kinds of guests on his program. And many times he invited somebody who was just getting started out. And thanks to being on that program, that person got attention and eventually went on to become a star. So Dave Letterman did a lot of good deeds in his life. One night, near the end of his career, Dave Letterman had a different kind of a program. Usually he had 2, 3, sometimes 4 people on his program. He only had one. He invited one person whose name I would guess nobody here, or probably nobody here has ever heard of, Warren Zevon. Warren Zevon, Z-E-V-O-N. Warren Zevon in his time was a very, very great entertainer. He was a composer. He was a guitarist. And he was one of the pioneers of rock and roll. And Dave Letterman gave him a start. He put him on the program when nobody knew who he was, and he put him on many, many times after that. And he helped to make Warren Zevon into a star. And then this time, he invited them and only him. And as soon as Warren Zevon came on stage and got 3/4 of the way into his chair, Dave Letterman hit him with one question. He said, Warren, is it true what I hear? Is it true that you've got cancer? And is it true that if it is, how has it changed your life? That's quite a question to ask a guy before he's even sat down. And Zevon said, yeah, it's true. I got terminal cancer. And how has it changed my life? Well, for one thing, whenever I take my clothes to the dry cleaner, I put them on special, because otherwise I'm afraid by the time they come back, I might not be here. So I pay a little extra and I put them on special. That was a funny line, but coming from a guy who's got terminal cancer, to answer with such a funny line? Letterman smiled and he said, come on, Warren, stop kidding around. This is serious. What advice do you have for me and for anybody else who may someday be in your position? Give us whatever advice you've got and no kidding around. And Warren Zevon thought for a moment and he said, my advice to those of you who are here tonight who are mortal is always enjoy your lunch. Every single bite. And don't gulp it down in order to get to something more important, because there's nothing more important than what you're doing right now. That's my advice. And what he was saying is everything is important and nothing should be rushed and nothing should be gulped just to get to something else. That's not the way to live. Enjoy every minute while you have it. Don't put down this minute to get to tomorrow. You might not get tomorrow. You might, when you get to tomorrow, it might not be important. And even if it's important, it's not as any more important than this one moment that you're in right now. If you're with a girl right now, you're eating lunch right now, whatever you're composing right now, you're producing, you're performing right, whatever you're doing right now, do it now with heart and soul and mind. You worry about tomorrow when today's over. And when he said that, Dave Letterman wiped a tear off his eyes, and you could see the people in the orchestra wiping tears off their eyes, because what he said was very moving. And I think, though Dave Letterman may not have known it, Warren Cooper, Zevon may not have known it, he was writing a commentary on Psalm 100. What does Psalm 100 say? Ivdu et Adonai b'simcha. Worship God with joy. Worship God with love. Worship God with excitement. Worship God with jokes, because you don't have any guarantee about tomorrow. And then Warren Zevon did something amazing. I think it was an hour program. This was the first 5 minutes. For the next 55 minutes, he sat at the mic and played from his compositions, every one of them, old ones and brand new ones that nobody ever, and he sang them. And if he had a chorus, he didn't skip the chorus. He went back to the chorus every time. And many of them were about life and a lot of them were about death. And he did them over and over, and people rose to applaud, and he just kept on playing, ignored the applause. For 55 minutes, he played all his music. And then when it was over, he was sopping wet and he was exhausted. And he took one bow. And then he waited He waited until the curtain fell, because the last thing he wanted to do, he did not want to do in public. The last thing he wanted to do, he waited till, he didn't want to make a fuss about it. He didn't want to make a big to-do about it. He wanted to do it. So when the curtain came down and the camera was off, he took off his guitar, which had been his instrument, the one guitar that he'd played for 40, 50 years. The guitar, which was like his right hand, took it off, handed it to Dave Letterman, the man who had given him his first opportunity in show business, the man who had made his career possible. He took it off, he handed it to Dave Letterman, and he said, "Here, I don't need it anymore." And he started to walk off stage, and he turned around and he said, "Take good care of it." And that's all. He didn't say thank you. He didn't say I owe you. He didn't say this is payback. Waved goodbye and walked off stage. I have a hunch, I can't prove it, that the man who wrote, the woman who wrote Psalm 100, it could have been a man, it could have been a woman, we don't know, that he had that same kind of mentality. If do it at Hashem b'simcha means eat your sandwich without gulping it down. Worship God with joy means don't worry about tomorrow. Tomorrow will take care of itself. Don't worry about yesterday. Yesterday's over. Whatever you're doing now, do now. Do it with all your heart and soul and might. And then when it's over, it's over. It's over, it's finished. And I think that that's what Psalm 100 is really trying to teach us. Live today, live with joy, live with purpose. Don't worry about yesterday. Yesterday causes more harm. Worrying about yesterday causes so much harm. You get so many people sick. If only I'd done this yesterday. You didn't. Finished. If only I'd ever said this, if only I'd done this yesterday. If only married this girl instead of that girl, gone into this business instead of that business. Who cares what you should have done yesterday? It's gone. You can't bring it back. And the other thing that gets people sick is, oh, what am I going to do tomorrow? Should I do this or should I do that? You'll find out tomorrow. Doesn't do any good to worry about it today. You can't do anything about tomorrow today. What should you do today? Serve God in joy. If you ever go to the morning minyan, by the way, for some reason, korban todah is not set on Shabbos. I think probably because the korban wasn't sacrificed for Thanksgiving was not brought on Shabbos. Anyway, korban todah is said every day of the week except Shabbos. It's said at the beginning of Psukei de Zimra, the second of the 4 sections of the morning service, which is a section of songs of celebration of life and of gratitude. It starts with the 100th song. And you're supposed to say it standing up, if you can. The shul that I go to, by the way, has a very nice custom, which I wish B'nai Torah would adopt. Shuls were built with no sense for the handicapped. You know, how do you get up those stairs? How do you get up those stairs? So now they read the Torah down below, so you can get up without having to climb the stairs. That's progress. And still, handicapped people feel very handicapped in most shuls. How do you get up to the bima? How do you, in one of the shuls that I go to, every time we come to a passage where you have to stand, the rabbi says, and now will those people who are able to rise please stand, and will the others please remain seated? That's a nice touch. It makes you feel not left out if you can't get up. You know, I remember going to Yom Kippur and on B'nai Torah this year, and I felt so strange. Everybody else was getting up. These are prayers I've gotten up for all my life, And now I can't get up. And I have to sit through them. I have to sit through Kol Nidre. I have to sit through Al Chet. It felt very strange. Finally, at Nila, I couldn't take it anymore. So the last Al Chet of Nila, I got up and promptly fell over. Because I was stupid to have done that. I attracted more attention than I wanted to. But schools should be tactful to those who can't see. For example, I think there are a couple of hearing aids at the entrance to Bnei Torah. And there ought to be magnifying glasses there, so that those who can't read small print, and they make print smaller every year as you get older, should be able to read the Siddur. And they should have large type Siddurim, not for everybody, but for those who need them. And they should have places to put that damn thing that I have to schlep around so that it doesn't block the Torah when it's going by. And they should have they should be sensitive to the needs of the handicapped. Really, B'nai Torah is getting better, but all of us have a way to go. Anyway, you're supposed, if you ever go to the morning minyan and they come to Mizmor L'Toda, if you can stand, stand. If you can't, you can't. And sing it with gratitude. Sing it with fervor. And remember what Art Green said about it. It's a song to gratitude, for the ability to feel grateful. Not just a song of gratitude to God. It's also a song to the quality of gratitude, which enriches our lives. If you can't feel gratitude, you are a lonely, isolated, selfish person. If you can't, how many times a day do you say thank you? I'll tell you now what I'm going to say about my wife, which is that I was in the room yesterday and somebody called on the phone. I don't know who it was. Maybe it was a nudnik, maybe we were selling something, or maybe it was a doctor, secretary with an appointment to test results. I have no idea what it was. And I wasn't really listening to the conversation. But when she finished the call, Sue said, "And thank you for calling." And I was struck by that phrase, "Thank you for calling." To somebody who's confined to a recliner and for whom the phone rarely rings and to whom very few, if any people ever come to visit, either because they're afraid of COVID or because they got their own sorrows or because they're busy with their own lives. For whatever reason, very few, if any, people come to visit and very few, if any, people call. And so when somebody calls, she says, "Thank you for calling." And that's a lesson I would suggest. I don't know if I'll tell when Sue's around, she's kind of shy, but that's a lesson we should learn. How many times a day do you find yourself saying thank you? 1, 2, 5, 10? Count one day and see. It's not a fair test if you're counting because you're aware, but how many times a day do we say that to anybody? When the butter falls and lands on the right side, not on the wrong side, you got to say thank you. And when you find a parking place, for sure you ought to say thank you. And when somebody says, "I like that dress you're wearing," you ought to say thank you. And there are probably, if you think, a lot of other examples. And therefore, I hope that you'll say Psalm 100, and you'll say it with fervor. And when you do, you remember what Art Green taught us about it, and you remember what Avram Twersky taught us about it, which is you don't have to feel guilty. You don't have to be depressed. You don't have to feel you're a failure. You don't have to feel that you have to be perfect, because God made you. God made us. We didn't make ourselves. It's not our fault that we're not perfect. He only made us to be good. He didn't make us to be perfect. And do you know any people who are perfect? Or think they're perfect? Or think they have to be perfect? You know any perfectionists? Somebody once said, I was looking for years for Mr. Right. And I finally found him. And I married him. How was I to know his first name was always? How was I supposed to know to get it? That his first name was always. It's hard to live with somebody, I shouldn't say believe me, but it's hard to live with somebody who's always right, who's never able to give in, who's never able to see anybody else's point of view. It's got to be done perfectly, and therefore I got to do it. You can't help me clean up because you'll make a mistake. You'll drop something. You won't clean it dry enough. And so I'll do it. I'll do it my way because I do it right. Do you know anybody like that? They're really hard to live with, such people. And we have them in politics, you have them in government. It's going to be my way or else. I'm never going to compromise. I'm never going to bend. It's got to be, you have them in shuls, every board has one guy like that. It's got to be his way. And I'm not looking at anybody when I say this. And many families have somebody who has to always be right. And many classes have somebody who's always right. And that's not the way to live. So I think we ought to learn from Art Green and Dr. Tversky, and we ought to learn from, maybe above all, from Warren Zevon, this non-Jewish guitar player who taught us the lesson, which is the key to Psalm 100, Ivdu et Adonai b'simcha, to worship God, not perfectly. God doesn't ask us to be perfect. We should worship God with joy. Thank you. I came out less than an hour. I thought we'd take more. Okay. Anybody, any questions, any comments? Got one more session to go. And let me just tell you, I'm hoping with Zena's help to put these talks I gave last semester and this semester, if Zena has them recorded, because a lot of the good stuff in them was ad lib. It was not in my text. I'm hoping if Zena